Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in Greenville, South Carolina. You can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your real estate needs. And just a reminder, Piper Insurance Group is sponsoring this episode like they have for several episodes in a row now. They can help you out with all your home, auto, and umbrella insurance needs. They're independent, so they can quote multiple different insurance companies and give you the best rate that they can find. Licensed in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, basically the core of the Southeast, right? So they can help you out in all three of those states, including on investment properties like flips, rentals, ground-up new construction, residential, commercial, all of that. Their contact information is in the show notes, so reach out to them for a free quote today. And please like, rate, review, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of the show. I would appreciate that. Those are the only things that I ask of you guys. So this past week has been kind of miserable for me. I had a week of sickness. I am still feeling under the weather. Had a few days where I functionally just took off. I was able to push some things around to ensure that the sickness didn't impact my work. But man, there's a lot of stuff going around right now, and I know other people that have gotten sick. But I'm on the tail end of it. I'm glad that I recorded the podcast when I did last week, because if I had waited, I would not have gotten a podcast out. I mean, my voice was really rough. Still not the best, still not 100%, but I'm getting there. And I am just excited that this past week is over, right? We had an election. Obviously, that was a big thing. I said last week that I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about it. Of course, multiple people reached out to me and asked if I could talk about it. And I'm not going to be talking about, but for those that know me well, I'm really big into politics. I follow politics very closely. I'm involved locally in our local political scene in various ways. I'm not going to discuss this from a political standpoint, but I do want to discuss these elections because, again, people reached out to me about it. I do think it's worthwhile discussing. We talked a few times about, what is Trump saying? What is Harris saying with regard to the housing market? And now we know that Trump is going to be in the White House. As I'm recording this, almost certainly he's also going to have both the House and the Senate in red, meaning that he can kind of do whatever he wants. And so I think it is worthwhile to discuss what impact this might have on the real estate market, on housing, moving forward. Now, this is a Greenville podcast, but this is a classic example of a national thing, something happening nationally that will ultimately have an impact on Greenville real estate. So even though real estate is local, and I talk about that a lot, there are national trends that do impact local housing markets. And so this is going to be one of those episodes where I focus more on what's happening nationally and how that will indirectly or directly impact our Greenville real estate market than it is something Greenville specific. So let me start with this. The markets were extremely jittery leading up to the election. And here's what I've learned about markets, like the bond market, the stock market, the real estate market, etc. People just want to know what's happening. It doesn't even matter what's happening, right? They just don't like uncertainty. In fact, I saw a stat recently that showed that after every recent election, the stock market has gone up. And it doesn't even matter which candidate wins at the end of the day, so much as the fact that everyone is clear on who won and that there just isn't chaos. Really, the markets just want to see stability. That's all they're looking for. And the chaos of election season is something that markets don't like. And we see that. I mean, I talk to people, I'm not a big stock trader or I'm not a big crypto guy or anything like this. But in terms of real estate, I talk to people that say, you know what, I'm going to sit on the sidelines until I know what's happened. I know what's going on in our country, who's been elected, all of that. So it's a real thing. It definitely happens. And it reminds me a little bit of a scene from the Dark Knight movie where the Joker says, you know what I've noticed? I'm not going to do Heath Ledger's epic Joker voice. But he says, you know what I've noticed? Nobody panics when things go according to plan. even if the plan is horrifying. That's pretty accurate when it comes to markets. Nobody panics when things go according to plan, even if the plan is horrifying. They just want things to go according to plan. In fact, this is actually, we've actually seen a little bit of a change in this regard from 2016. Nate Silver, whose election model correctly predicted that Trump would swing, would sweep the swing states, in addition to some others that I heard that live in New York City. He was in New York City the day after Trump was elected, both in 2016 and this year. Okay. And he said in 2016, the day after the election, people in New York were acting like 9/11 had just happened. Last week, the day after the election, business as usual. Trump didn't burn the economy to the ground 8 years ago, and he's unlikely to do it this time. And so markets are kind of okay with Trump being president. You could maybe argue that that markets are really excited about Trump being president, as we saw all sorts of different stock indexes and crypto, whatnot, soaring in the aftermath of his election. But as I said, it's not uncommon for that sort of thing to happen after an election. So I don't think that we can draw major conclusions from any of that. If you want to draw major conclusions from that, fine. Do your thing. I'm not going to do that on this show. Now, I've discussed previously on the show that the 10-year yield was soaring in anticipation that Trump, who has pledged to spend something like $7 trillion, essentially, over the next 4 years, has several inflationary proposals, like heavy tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. And so markets were concerned about all of these things, combined with the fact that Trump might get a sweep of Congress, which is looking like is going to happen, and that basically inflation would take off. So investors essentially calculated that based on this potential outcome, that they wanted to dump their money into the stock market, into crypto, and into other investments rather than bonds. Okay, so the result is when bonds get sold, then the 10-year yield goes up. And when stocks, crypto, etc. are bought, their valuations also go up. And that's precisely what happened leading up to the elections. We saw stocks, crypto, etc. start to go up. We also saw the 10-year yield go up, which means that bonds are being sold. And so traders were responding to the uncertainty, again, the chaos of the election. They wanted to know the election results. And they were hoping, I think, generally speaking, for a divided Congress. So as the election results were coming in on Tuesday, a lot of people were looking at Polymarket and various election betting markets. If you're not aware of the election betting markets by this point, don't worry about it. You're not missing out on anything, in my personal opinion. I personally was looking more at the 10-year yield because election betting markets are brand new in their infancy. And one thing, if you know anything about betting, it takes a while for betting markets to stabilize, right? When betting and when sports betting became a big thing throughout our country, it took a while for people to kind of understand how to actually make money and do things that had predictive value in the sports betting world. And so I think that betting markets in the election realm are going to be similar. We're going to have to go through a few election cycles to really see how accurate their predictive power is. That being said, the bond market has a robust, predictable history. And so I was looking more at that, specifically the 10-year yield, because that is directly connected to the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, as we've discussed before. And sure enough, the 10-year yield started to soar on Tuesday. And that was an early indicator to me that Trump was going to win, and most likely that Republicans were going to control Congress as well. In fact, Logan Motoshami of Housing Wire, who's a good follow if you're on Twitter or if you like podcasts like this, he's got a podcast out there that you can listen to. He's a big 10-year yield analyst, and he called very early on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, that Trump would win early on Tuesday evening on the basis of what the 10-year yield was doing. I had similar feelings. I was tracking it in the same way that he was. He and I are very much on the same page with a lot of this stuff. Now, why is all of this important? Well, as I've already alluded to, mortgage rates are tied to the 10-year yield. If the 10-year yield goes up, mortgage rates go up. If it goes down, mortgage rates go down, generally speaking. And naturally, we saw the 30-year fixed rate mortgage go from the low sixes in September all the way up to the low sevens on Tuesday. A huge over 100 basis point jump in just 2 months. And that's primarily because of jitters and concerns, like I said, over one party controlling the government and causing crazy inflation. Well, since this election has come and gone, markets have actually settled down a little bit. Various stock market indexes, as I've already said, hit highs recently, but I'm not drawing major conclusions from that at this point. The 10-year yield was no exception. Basically, once markets knew that the uncertainty was over, the 10-year yield dropped from around 4.47 to around 4.3. So that was really important, right? Not that drop is that substantial to have, that huge of an increase, but it just showed that markets were stabilizing and that upward trend that we had been seeing in the 10-year was starting to normalize again. Mortgage rates also dropped per Mortgage News Daily, which is a good index to follow for that's like a composite of mortgage averages, dropped from 7.13 to 6.92, and I believe that's where it currently sits today. As I'm recording this. So, and again, just a reminder, the fact that this composite says that rates are at 6.92, that doesn't mean that you would lock in a 6.92 rate right now. People with good credit are going to get a lot better than 6.92, probably in many cases the mid sixes. That's something to talk to your loan officer about. Also, it indirectly helped mortgage rates that the Fed reduced their benchmark funds rate by 25 basis points last week. But that was really already priced in by markets. So the only way that would have actually had a true impact is if the Fed hadn't reduced their rates, and then markets would have freaked out because they had already priced in that the Fed was going to reduce their rates. So instead, if you didn't hear that the Fed reduced their rates last week, that's because it was a big ho-hum moment for the market in general. People were expecting it. Nothing happened that wasn't expected. They didn't make any major statements that were any major surprise to anyone. So life just moves on. I think that that's all important for understanding what's going to happen moving forward. Okay, there is a universal consensus that Trump is going to want lower rates. That is about the only thing that everyone agrees on, right? It was a big deal for him during his first administration. You may forget that towards the end of Trump's first term, rates were starting to creep up in 2019 before COVID, and Trump wasn't happy about it. He called out Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, multiple times about it. And the media, as a matter of fact, has already asked Powell if he would step down if Trump asked him to, which is pretty likely that Trump will do that. And Powell said he wouldn't. Right? So a showdown is set here, and I've already said on this podcast that it's highly likely at some point in the future that a political party attempts a partisan takeover of the Federal Reserve, perhaps similar to how the courts have become partisan despite them being allegedly independent. And could that happen under Trump's administration? I think that's very possible. So this is something to watch very closely. Based on political donations, it's clear that the Fed is primarily made up of Democrats. So I would imagine that Trump will want to change it. How will he go about that? What will he do? I'm really not sure, right? The Federal Reserve is the most powerful part of our government that currently doesn't have a direct party affiliation. Like I just said, you can look at political donations and conclude that the Fed currently is on the left of the political spectrum. But are they running for office, as a Fed governor or Fed president or chairman? Are they running as a Republican or Democrat? No, that's not how it works. They are supposed to be independent. But again, independency is kind of going away just in general in our government. So at some point, we can expect for partisanship to take over the Fed if it hasn't already. But ultimately, I think that Trump needs to focus less on the Fed and focus more on keeping inflation down. This is something that he can control, and it will have much more of an impact than whatever it is that the Fed is doing at this point, particularly when it comes to the 10-year yield and mortgage rates. As it is, we finally reached a point a few months ago where the Fed's actions have actually become decoupled from bond markets and from mortgage rates, meaning that what the Fed is doing is already so priced in that nobody is even flinching at the Fed's actions unless they do something dramatically unexpected. As I already said, this past week, that's precisely what happened. Nobody flinched when the Fed reduced rates. It was just kind of like, yeah, we already knew they were going to do that. In other words, for the past 2 years until fairly recently, traders were really trying to read the tea leaves on what the Fed was doing to determine what they would do in the future. Now traders are more or less ignoring the Fed and focusing, from what I can see, 100% on the economic data. And so in my opinion, Trump should focus on that rather than focusing on the Fed. If he focuses too much on the Fed, I think that will be an immediate tactical error by his administration. My theory is that if markets believe that Trump's administration won't bring additional inflation, that we could actually see mortgage rates drop really rapidly, perhaps even down below 6%, which it hasn't been in quite some time. I think we could easily see the mid fives, a level that mortgage rates haven't been at, again, per Mortgage News Daily, since 2022. Because if markets feel good about the direction of the economy, traders will buy more bonds as the stock market gets tapped out, as crypto gets tapped out. People get concerned that that's being overvalued at some point, and that will then bring down the 10-year yield, and market stability would also likely bring the spread between the 10-year yield and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage down. At least that's my theory. Right now, the spread, as we call it, basically the difference between the 10-year yield and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, is higher than it is in times of market stability. In recent history, the spread was closer to 150 basis points, meaning that with the 10-year yield at 4.3, which is roughly where it's at while I'm recording this, mortgage rates would be in the 5.8% range, not in the 6.92% marker where they currently sit as I'm recording this. Again, according to Mortgage News Daily. So we could still see rates drop quickly, even if the Fed doesn't do anything. But it all rests on inflation coming down and staying down, and markets then responding to that and believing in that. And economists, quite frankly, believe that Trump's campaign proposals would add substantial inflation to the economy, especially if he gets into massive deportations and tariffs. So let's talk about that for a second. We know that from Trump's first term, when he says something on the campaign trail, it's usually a lot more aggressive of a proposal than what he ends up implementing. So is it possible he will be more aggressive in his second term than he was in his first term? Yes, it is possible. It is possible that he ends up being more aggressive and ends up perhaps following through on some of these tariff and deportation proposals that he's made. But at the moment, we only have his first term to look at, and there's no evidence based on that he's going to be ultra aggressive right at the beginning of his second term. From 2015 to 2016, if you remember, he ran on massive tariffs during that period of time, as well as immigration measures as well, building the wall, all of that, if you forget. But a lot of those things didn't materialize in the way that he said that they would. He didn't even implement those tariffs that he ran so heavily on until 2018, and they were very targeted so as to have a minimal impact on the economy and inflation. Much, much more targeted than what he had said he would do during his campaign. In fact, he started imposing tariffs on Mexico, but then rescinded them when Mexico reached a deal with the Trump administration on illegal immigration. So it's probably fair to assume that something like this will happen again, that Trump won't be as extreme on tariffs as he has suggested, perhaps maybe not as extreme on deportation as he's suggested as well, because if he were to be as extreme as he's campaigned, these things would almost certainly plunge our economy back into a high inflation environment. And yes, I believe that the mass deportations would do that too, because basically the economy is just people, right? It's people and the hours that they're working and the amount of production that they are accomplishing during those hours. That literally is what the economy is. So if you remove people, you hurt the economy like that. There's going to be some people that are going to disagree with me on it. Go to your economic textbooks and tell me what in there indicates that would change. I'm not saying that illegal immigration is good for our economy, not suggesting that. I'm just saying that if you take a bunch of people currently that are producing in our workforce and get rid of them, it's going to hurt the economy And so that's something to keep in mind. Now, all of this, where I'm going with all of this, is that Trump likes to make big, bold, sometimes extreme proposals as a negotiating starting point, and then typically he dials it back later. And I'm hoping personally that trend continues in the second term that he's going to start next January. At the end of the day, however, I think that Trump will be very focused on getting the housing market back on track. Now, he didn't campaign much on housing affordability, but he did campaign on the economy. And there are only really two things, in my opinion, holding back the economy right now: inflation and the housing market. Now, I'm a realtor, so you may think I'm just saying that the housing market is holding back the economy because it's holding back my business personally, right? But I'll show you why that's not true. If you're on YouTube, I'm going to show you a graph of construction employment. Here we go. If you're on YouTube, you can see it. Now, I need to back this out. Currently, it's a little bit zoomed in. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to show you employment history construction employment history going all the way back to the 1940s. One very unmistakable trend, if you look at this, is every recession, construction employment goes down. Every single one of them. In many cases, you start to see the employment start to go down prior to the recession, and then it really takes off during the recession. But it is one of the most reliable trackers of a recession that we have. When employment construction goes down, we are either in a recession or likely headed towards one. And so the question we have to ask, right, is it cause or effect, right? Are employees losing jobs because the economy is cratering, right, in all of these recessions, or is it the fact that the housing market collapses and construction jobs collapse with it, that then is a major contributing factor that causes us to go into a recession? Is it cause or effect? I would say yes. Both of those things can be simultaneously true. The housing market, and by extension development, is impacted by the broader economy, but then it also impacts the economy in turn, right? And so we have to look at more what's going on in the economy to kind of parse this out. And in the environment we're currently living in, where various economic indicators are quite healthy, having the housing market now in a multi-year recession, which even though prices are still high, housing has been in a recession since June 2022, as I've stated multiple times on here, that you can be in a recession without prices dropping. In fact, very few months or quarters in our nation's history have we seen prices drop despite having all of these recessions. Again, if you're looking on YouTube, you can see every grayed out area is a recession. We've had a bunch of these recessions, but guess what? Only 2 of these recessions saw home prices dropping, okay? So we can have a recession and a housing market recession without housing prices dropping. And by many metrics, we have been in a housing recession since June 2022. And so, long story short, even though prices are still high and all of that, we have been in a housing market recession. And eventually that will drag down the economy. Like, it will happen. And so this is where I think that these charts come into play, is because even though depending on different situations, you know, the construction employment and the housing market can be more of a cause or can be more of an effect of a recession. I think in this case, with all of these other economic indicators showing that the economy is doing okay, if we were to start to see these numbers, these employment numbers for construction, start to lag and start to go down, I think that would be an indicator that the housing market is going to negatively impact the broader economy. Okay, so I think that this is super duper important. This is something that very few people are talking about, and I think that we need to look at this very closely. Now, again, if you're looking at this chart, you can see that the construction employment is still going up, right? And even though it's still growing, it has slowed substantially. In 2024, we've only added 164,000 construction jobs year to date from January through October. We don't have the November numbers yet. This is down from January through October of 2023, only slightly. It was 166,000 jobs January through October 2023. But if you look back at 2022, January through October, it's way down. That was 252,000 construction jobs added during that period of time. And so we have now seen 2 straight years of lagging numbers when it comes to employment, construction employment data. And so that's not great. Now, actually, if we looked at things in a vacuum, the 164,000 construction jobs number would generally be an okay number in most years. It wouldn't be a great number, but certainly not a problematic number. But the problem is that construction employment never rebounded from the pandemic. I'm going to share something very similar, but something that I've annotated. All right, this is the same graph. If you're again looking on YouTube, the same graph that I just showed you, but I added a line showing from 2010 the growth in employment for construction employees from 2010 up through the pandemic, and then what it would have continued to be had we just continued in the same trend that we were going in from 2010. Okay, you can see very clearly here there's a huge gap from where construction employment is now in comparison to where it would have been had we kept up the pre-pandemic pace. So we never rebounded from the pandemic in terms of construction employment. If we kept up with the pre-pandemic pace of job growth, we'd be at roughly 8.75 million jobs in construction. Instead, we're at roughly 8.31 million, again, as of the end of October, nearly 500,000 difference in employment. So that's huge. Okay, so we never made up the deficit in construction jobs, and construction job growth is slowing. That's a very bad combination. In fact, from September to October, so 1 month on month, September to October of 2024, only 8,000 construction jobs were added. So on an annualized basis, that would come out to 96,000 added construction workers, which would be very, very poor job growth and a likely recession indicator. Okay, we don't want that to happen. So Trump was voted in, really, to come back to him, he was voted in for 3 reasons, in my opinion: to improve the economy, to increase border security, and to stand for traditional social values. There's a lot of data that points in that direction, that those 3 things were his mandate. And regardless of whether you think he can, will, or even should focus on those things, the data shows, as I've already said, unequivocally that this is his mandate. His legacy will hinge in large part on how he succeeds in these 3 areas, or how people perceive that he succeeds in those 3 areas. And I can assure you, Trump is laser focused on his reputation and on his, well, maybe not his reputation, but on his legacy right now. That is going to be a huge part of how he governs the next 4 years. So I don't think that it will take long before he starts looking at the housing market, because like I said, this is a big, big wild card, and perhaps the one thing that could completely derail the economy right now. So what will he do about it? Well, quite frankly, it's unclear. He has talked about, and we've discussed, some of this will be review from what we talked about in the past, but he's talked about using federal lands to build futuristic cities, which sounds like a really cool idea, but would that really put a dent in the housing market? Probably not. First off, it would take years to accomplish. And then, if he accomplished it, to what extent would it be accomplished? How many people would it truly impact? Would people really want to move, displace themselves from where they are to one of these futuristic cities? I don't know. And at the end of the day, he has to have some immediate wins in order to have success in the 2026 midterms to maintain congressional control. So doing something like this that would take probably at the very least the entire 4 years of his presidency to build futuristic cities on federal land. I think that Trump is going to want to have some more immediate wins to get under notches on his belt before 2026. So will he inject stimulus into the housing market? Down payment assistance, tax breaks, perhaps for first-time home buyers. Harris made proposals like this, but as I've already said on the show, I believe that generally speaking, her proposals for putting stimulus into the housing market would be bad for the housing market long term. I could see a scenario where the Fed even responds to stimulus if Trump were to try to do something like that by tightening things on their end, which would then potentially make rates go up. Like I said before, Trump needs to be laser focused on bringing down inflation. If he does that, rates will come down substantially, making it substantially cheaper to buy a home without crashing the housing market. That's what we want. We want something that will improve the market now without destroying it or impacting it negatively later. And usually stimulus helps now but hurts later. So I am generally against government stimulus into private markets. How about this? Will he restructure the government's relationship to mortgages? This is being discussed quite a bit because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are private companies that have been held in government conservatorship since the global financial crisis. And during Trump's first administration, he wanted to return them 100% to the private market so the government wasn't responsible for them anymore, right? It was immensely unpopular when they were bailed out by the government and then taken into conservatorship back in the global financial crisis. People now have just kind of gotten used to it, right? It's been a long time. It's been nearly 20 years since that's happened. But Trump doesn't like it. A lot of people don't like it. Why does it matter? Well, they play a huge role in mortgages. Fannie and Freddie don't make mortgages, but they underpin the bulk of the U.S. housing market by buying home loans from lenders, wrapping them into securities, and then guaranteeing repayment of principal and interest to investors. So long term, I think that getting Fannie and Freddie out of government conservatorship probably is a good idea, right? I'm not a big fan of our government controlling the housing market so directly. But some predict that if we pulled them out, which at the very earliest would not be able to happen until 2026. Let's be clear. This is not something that's going to happen right away. Okay. It would take years to unbundle Fannie and Freddie from the government. But some predict that this, if and when it happened, that this would cause mortgage rates to go up. And this is something that Vice President Harris talked about a little bit during her campaign. That being said, it's really unclear if that's true. So for now, I think we just have to watch this one and see what comes out of it. This one could be one that, perhaps if the housing market is in better shape in 2026, 2027, maybe at that point, it makes sense to restructure Fannie and Freddie, privatize them once again, and then maybe if there is a little bit of short-term pain, maybe that's okay because the housing market is already doing all right. But I would imagine that Trump wants to tread lightly on that at the beginning due to the risk of potential fallout there. What else? Trump has talked about deregulation when it comes to development, but as I've discussed on here before, most regulations on development are on the state and local level. So he'd have to find a way to offer federal incentives to local municipalities to deregulate. Now, Trump has actually a decent history of finding ways to bring national housing policies into the local sphere. For instance, when he introduced the concept of opportunity zones, which is something that we've seen some developers in Greenville take advantage of, that was an interesting pilot program for a national program that trickled down to the local level. It wasn't a huge thing, right? If you've never heard of opportunity zones, that it didn't completely change the game, but it did have an impact on some low-income areas and some other things. So that could perhaps be a pilot that he's looking at, a pilot program for also then trying to deregulate as well. But deregulation, at the end of the day, let's just be realistic. It's going to be hard to pull off at scale in all of these states and local municipalities. And I'm skeptical that he can pull it off. And quite frankly, I don't think it would have the impact at home prices he thinks it would. He thinks home prices are impacted 30% by regulation. I've seen mixed things on that. I'm not sure that it's quite 30% of the cost of housing is 100% regulation. I think that there's a lot of other complicating factors in there. But we'll see. We'll see if he's able to have any impact on that. I personally don't think he will. I also think Trump and many others overestimate the impact that illegal immigration has on the cost of housing. Look at the charts on home prices, and they are correlated not with immigration trends, but with mortgage rate trends. And if mortgage rates go up, the housing market slows down, and it really doesn't matter how many immigrants are entering the country. As I've discussed before, let me just say this, okay? I always need to hedge this. I'm not for illegal immigration. Nothing I say on here is for illegal immigration. We need to fix the illegal immigration problem. Okay, I've said that. But with regard to the current immigration issues that we have, I don't think that they are meaningfully contributing to housing affordability. Could it be a difference of 1%, the prices being 1% higher than they could be? Sure, maybe. But is it having an impact? Would prices be 10% lower if we didn't have the immigration problem that we have had the past several years? I don't think so. I don't think it has nearly that sort of an impact. So I don't think that any sort of deportation measures or strengthening our border, I really don't see that having a very big impact on housing. So what do I think? Well, I have mixed feelings, right? I do have concerns that Trump, with a fully red Congress, is going to spend us into more inflation, right? He's proposed $7 trillion of spending over the course of the next 4 years, and that concerns me. And even though Biden got blamed for the post-COVID inflation that happened, let's not pretend like Trump didn't also play a role, right? Remember those stimulus payments he made to everyone in 2020? He sent out a whole letter telling people you're about to get more money because I'm writing you, checks. If you don't think that played a role in the housing market, think again. It played a huge role, including the rental market, where rents and even security deposits started to soar. So inflation happened in housing, in rentals, in shelter, all of that as a direct result of the stimulus that Trump did and then that Biden continued to do. When people have more cash, they typically spend it. And when that causes a supply and demand imbalance, inflation happens. It's really that simple. However, I also know that Trump is going to take his mandate to fix the economy seriously. And as I stated earlier, the housing market is arguably the most important part of the economy currently lagging behind. So if Trump assembles the right team around him, and honestly, I've been encouraged by some of the people he's announced so far that are going to be on his team, then I think he could potentially show some patience, let the economy stabilize, or see if the economy stabilizes, and then see if rates improve from there. If rates improve, the housing market will rebound. Like, it's really that simple. Mortgage rates don't improve, then all bets are off. Construction employment will start cratering, and the broader economy could start to teeter, at which point Trump would likely want to start taking some really big action. And quite frankly, the Fed would too, right? I think that they would be on the same page when it comes to that. So I think at the end of the day, it's not just the economy stupid, as James Carville famously said. When it comes to housing, you could say it's the mortgage rates stupid, right? It's literally that simple. It just comes down to mortgage rates right now, particularly in this environment where so many people are experiencing that lock-in effect where they're locked into a 3%, 2%, maybe even a 4 or 5% mortgage, and they don't want to go up to 6.5% or 7%. They just don't want to. And so mortgage rates are going to continue to be the story under the Trump administration. And my guess is that mortgage rates will remain in the mid to high 6s, maybe even the low 7s, until the market feels like they have a sense of what Trump is going to do. If the markets feel like Trump won't bring more inflation, we could really see rates drop fairly quickly, as I already said. If markets feel like Trump will bring on more inflation, then we could see rates soaring, 30-year fixed rate mortgage rates soaring back into the 7s, low sevens, mid sevens, maybe even high sevens. I don't know. Again, there's going to be a lot of reading the tea leaves here in the future, and we need to be careful with that. And we need to be data focused, which is what we will be, or at least what I will be, right? So 2025 is shaping up to be another wild one. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, hit that like, rate, review button, whatever platform you're using. You have options, right? At the very least, you can subscribe to the show. Most platforms, you can also like, rate, review, even comment if you're on YouTube. I try to respond to all of my thoughtful comments. We will all ride this out together. So thank you guys for listening. My contact information is in the show notes. If you need a realtor that understands all of these things in the Greenville market, I'm your guy. Piper Insurance Group also, their information is in the show notes. Please reach out to them for a free quote today, and we will talk again next time.